staying on top of the explosion of fentanyl, no neighborhood immune to the nationwide opioid crisis. And there's an economic as well as a human toll. Leaders in Arizona now saying that the epidemic cost their state more than $50 billion last year. They say that number factors in overdose deaths, reduced productivity, and quality of life for those with addictions, as well as expenses that Arizona faces as a border state. And as the number of overdose deaths continues to climb, some local governments are fighting back, taking aim at pharmacy chains. More than a dozen counties in Illinois now suing after similar lawsuits in Ohio, where a judge ordered CVS, Walgreens, and Walmart to pay more than $600 million in damages. Joining me now, Gerald Posner, investigative journalist and author of several books, including PHARMA, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. Gerald, thanks so much for being here.
Natasha, great to be with you.
First, should pharmacies be held accountable for the fentanyl epidemic, and why? Can you explain what role they play, and is this the best way to tackle the issue?
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of left this to the courts to resolve in many ways. And yes, the national retail chain pharmacies should be held responsible for the role they play. There were a lot of parties responsible here: the manufacturers of the opioids, the big drug companies, the drug distributors who sent them out, the doctors who overprescribed them. And in the end, the claim of these two counties, you mentioned this before, in Ohio, who successfully had this lawsuit against these three large channels, CVS, Walmart, and Walgreens. They said, you're the last line of defense in this process. If there are a whole bunch of fake prescriptions that are being written, if there are pill mills being run, if there are too many pills being sent into a specific town, you're the pharmacies that are supposed to say, no, we aren't going to fill them. And one example of these two counties in Ohio, one of them over a 4-year period had enough OxyContin sent to it for 400 pills for every resident of the town, including children and infants. So clearly, the number of pills being sent into the town, much too large for what anybody would expect. They're being filled by the pharmacies without many questions being asked. And in the end, these juries held they're responsible, and a judge held them responsible for $650 million in damage. It's an earthquake in terms of the opioid litigation.
That statistic's staggering. And we know fentanyl is the #1 killer of adults in the U.S., ages 18 to 45. And there's been a staggering rise in the overdose deaths over the last couple of years. How has the pandemic made things worse?
Well, the pandemic has certainly made things worse because it increased both the addiction rates and the overdose rates. We saw overdose rates in 2019, the last full year before the pandemic, that we thought had set a record near 100,000 a year. They broke records both in 2020 and 2021. Grim statistics to set. And you're right when you say that fentanyl is now the dominant form of how people are overdosing, because doctors in the medical profession and the manufacturers of legal opioids have suddenly gotten very strict on dispensing opioid painkillers. And as a result, people who have formed addictions to the legal prescription items over the years are now resorting to the illegal market, some of them to heroin, but many to fentanyl, which is 50 times stronger than morphine, 100 times stronger in many cases, and gives you a lot of pop for a very small amount of money, but is extremely dangerous.
And we know you've been immersed in many sides of this crisis, and it's such a complex one. And I do want to honor the fact that you've been sounding the alarm about fentanyl for more than 30 years now. Many of us think it's something new. It's not. After everything that you've learned, what do you think is the path forward to fixing this, and what needs to be done first?
I wish there was a simple answer, and the problem is that in this country, as in most countries, we are reactive. We have the problem develop, and then we react to it and try to plug it up then and figure out a way to solve it. And you're right, 32 years ago, I wrote about fentanyl for the first time, and when I was trying to write about it for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and others, nobody was really interested because they said, oh, it's a synthetic opioid, but it's not going to become a big problem. Now today we're sitting here in 2022. It's the dominant form in which people are getting addicted and overdosing in the United States. And so we're going to try to stop it at the border. We're going to try to have some rescue programs and harm reduction programs in cities to cut down on the number of overdoses. But it's all reactive, and that's a real shame. Nobody in the government is planning in advance. What can we do to stop the next wave of this opioid epidemic? Because we've been at it for 10 years. It's far too long. Far too many lives have been lost.
Gerald, in the last 20 seconds, what is the outlook for you if nothing changes here? What does it look like in the next 5 to 10 years?
Natasha, the worst part of this, in 5 or 10 years, you're going to be on a newscast at a network talking about this continuing opioid problem, but we won't be talking about fentanyl. We might be talking about a different product. And that's the danger here. We're talking about addiction. We're talking about families that have lost loved ones. And I'd love to see that number come down. Instead of being able to say to you, we have another grim statistic, another milestone, a record number of overdoses in the United States. Let's make 2022 the last year. That would be fantastic if it was possible.
All right, Gerald Posner, certainly appreciate your work on this, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Natasha, for having me.
All right.